I think we're all good. Let's get this webinar started. So, welcome to Preparing for the Unexpected, Redefining Crisis Communication Strategy. And thank you for joining us this morning. So this morning we'll be exploring how PR and comms have had to evolve to handle reputational and operational risk in 2024, which has certainly been a busy year so far already. I'm your host, PJ Boyd, that's me. I'm the content manager at Vulio. And we are joined today by, next slide, please, Stephen Waddington, the founder and managing partner of Wadds Inc, who will be sharing findings from our upcoming joint white paper on the subject, The Evolving Nature of Crisis Communications Management, which will be coming out next week. We'll have a presentation from Stephen and then a Q&A. So please do submit your questions in the Q&A section and also join the chat as well as we go. Any questions that we don't have time to get to will be answered by Stephen in a follow-up blog post. There'll also be a write-up of this session that we'll share along with the recording as well on the Vulio blog. So without further ado, I will pass over to Stephen.
Thanks, PJ, and good morning, everybody. I wanted to start actually with the trigger warning. It's probably a little bit early in the day for this, but just to say some of the topics we are discussing today are of a sensitive nature by their very nature. I will warn you if we dig into anything particularly sensitive, but just be prepared. There's some challenging issues that are going to come up during this session and highly emotive issues. So we've worked on a paper, Wadds Inc for Vulio. We've got a long-term partnership going back 2 or 3 years, and this is one of its best practice guides. As part of this, we have talked to a number of practitioners working at the sharp edge, if you like, of crisis communications to understand the changing nature of practice and emerging factors, and that's what we've put together. It's designed to help organizations prepare for crisis, plan strategy around crisis, respond and recover from crisis. So we're going to cover first things, changing nature of risk within organizations, what that means for crisis communication practice, and how we as practitioners need to respond to that. I'm going to start with the definition. So first of all, crisis is a situation that develops suddenly and is a threat to the normal operation of an organization. So it disrupts day-to-day operations activities and jeopardizes an organization's financial performance, its employees, its reputation, and its ability to function. I think that's an important place from the outset. Talking about, and PJ's already mentioned of this, we are operating in an increasingly complex geopolitical, environmental and societal perspective. The start point, I think, for any conversation around crisis management and risk should be what is actually the nature of risk. And there are many organizations around the world that do a really good job at exploring global risk and the risk we face. World Economic Forum is the report that I cite most frequently because it has a really interesting methodology and approach to risk, looking at both short-term 2-year outlook, but then long-term as well. Its latest report cites these, there's 25 areas of risk, but cites these 5 as the most critical for organizations over the next 2 years. So the first one relates to the discourse around artificial intelligence and the manipulation of media, the false spread of information, and that's misinformation and disinformation. It fuels polarization in society, it triggers all unrest, and it's an attack on the very nature of trust in society and organizations. So that's the first one. Second one, it's right there in front of us. We face it every day, especially if we're living in the UK, but issues related to extreme weather events. So in the UK, this manifests itself as in extreme heat in the summer and flooding in the winter, issues related to the ability of infrastructure, able to handle this from an environmental perspective, and disruption to both business operation and supply chain. The third one is societal polarization. We're sitting in the UK 4 days after the Prime Minister held an emergency press conference on Friday afternoon talking about this very issue. It's something that's front of mind for corporate communicators in any organisation, because it strikes at social cohesion and the very nature of the fabric of our societies. So that's third. Fourth one is cyber attacks, so threat to critical infrastructure around an organisation, characterised by ransomware attacks, external attacks on an organisation. And then the final one here, geopolitical conflict. So this is at the moment conflict in the Ukraine and Russia, issues and the conflict in Gaza, and emerging issues such as the situation in China and Taiwan. All of these have the potential to disrupt supply chain issue, impact the cost of living, and the very nature of financial markets. So these are outlooks. These are the top 5 of 25 risk factors on looking 2 years out. On a 10-year outlook, the World Economic Forum indexes higher and pulls up higher issues related to climate and artificial intelligence. So those maintain at the top of the leaderboard, and they're set to become more and more critical to organisations. I think it's an important place to start. The assertive place for public relations, corporate communications within management is helping organisations understand risk and the nature of risk around an organisation, and reports like the World Economics Forum report are a really useful indicator. Related to that first point of misinformation, it's so easy within society to create, with using artificial tools to create false information and contact. We saw this only last week with this event, the Willy Wonka experience in Glasgow, that was promoted as some extraordinary event using AI imagery that turned out not quite to be real. Didn't live up to the expectation of people who turned up and paid for 50 quid for a ticket. It just shows how easy it is. I've created here the classic media relations stunt of floating a barge down the river with a cockerel on the top, within 2 minutes on Mid-Journey. It just shows you how easy this stuff is to do, and we're at a time and a place where 50% of the world's population is going to head to the polls this year, notably in the EU, the UK, and the US, or with fractured societal contexts, and it's a significant concern. Within an organizational context, we spotted 2 areas of significant change to the contemporary risk environment, and those are in the nature of risks themselves. So crises that result from organizational values and crises that result from insider risk. I'm going to cover each of them in briefly. So the first one, the nature of the values-based crisis within an organization has arisen as a collective response to COVID-19. COVID-19, organizational leaders humanize how they communicated with publics. There was a real shift in how organizations commented and engaged in the public sphere. So initially it started with the responses to issues such as mental health and well-being, and then it developed to societal context, so issues such as Black Lives Matter and Roe versus Wade. 3 years on, this has resulted in a new area of crisis related to political and social values. So when an organization takes a stance on an issue that is in conflict with a societal or public perspective, it inevitably results in negative discourse and conflict with stakeholders. And that values-based crisis is something that's going to rise. And in my view, it's one of the most significant challenges facing corporate communicators at this point in time. The second one is the rise of insider risk. So the National Protective Security Authorities has done some really good work in this area, and it published a report in Toolkit actually in October last year that noted the rise of insider risk. Insider risks are events caused by individuals who have authorized access to an organization's resources, and they're either acting accidentally or intentionally. The nature of this risk has also increased in recent years. I'm really grateful actually to the author of the toolkit, Louise Watson, the NPSA toolkit. We call it out at the end of the report, and the end of this session, as an exemplar of best practice, because it describes the nature of this. Examples: Pfizer in 2021 had a departing employee, disgruntled employee, who downloaded 12,000 files, including those related to the COVID vaccine, intentionally to share them with a competitor. The year before that, Cisco had an attack where a number of its virtual machines were sabotaged, causing millions of dollars. So these types of risks are increasing. And this inside meets the outside perspective is an emergent threat. And I'm grateful also to Rob Cartwright. He's an independent consultant on reputation and risk, part of the CIPR Crisis Comms Network, who points out that often when we look at risk, we look from an externality perspective, whereas the vast majority of risks actually are from internal issues, so issues related to leadership, operations, structures, and governance, and so forth. And in not looking at these areas, we create a blind spot. So in any risk planning exercise, in any crisis management exercise, not only look at external risk, as highlighted by the World Economic Forum, but also your risk register should look at internal risk and all aspects of internal risk. And that, again, is an assertive position before the corp comms or the public relations role, particularly in an agency perspective, because often we have the permission to go to places where and challenge biases within the organization that wouldn't normally be challenged. In this next section, in terms of responding to crisis, I've got two sections. So I've got the changing nature of responses to risk, and that I'm going to come on to. And the first one is just a reflection on the fact that best practice and the basics of good crisis communication management in terms of preparation, management processes, and responses are timeless. And we were tested as a function during COVID-19 and got really fit in our response to crisis communication in terms of technology, media, and processes, and so forth. And these three tenets should lie at the core of any crisis response effort. So the role of the function in managing crisis comms, the situation, maintaining public trust, coordinating a complex stakeholder environment, and holding leadership to account. The preparedness that's tested through simulation exercises, where we can spot gaps in capability and we can put teams under pressure to help develop plans. And then finally, our ability as a function to continually monitor, horizon scan, if you like, to provide best-in-class data and the internal perspective into the organization. These are all core functions of public relations and corporate communications practice that are absolutely timeless and respond to best practice. If we consider more dynamic factors, there's three I particularly want to highlight. And the first is a point about diversity. Now, we have been debating, or researchers have been debating within corporate communications, and it was established as fact in the mid-80s that a diverse communication team, public relations team, will make better decisions and better response to any stakeholder of event. That makes, it would seem to be logical, right? But here we are, still 30, 40 years later, and we haven't got appropriate diversity and representation within corporate communications. And that's a real challenge. Now, since Grenfell and since the COVID pandemic, there's been a growing recognition of this issue, particularly within crisis response team. A best practice response team should involve members of the community that it seeks to engage. Now, it didn't within Grenfell, and it didn't within COVID, and those stories and lessons are well learned. There's a second issue actually though that makes this an even more important critical issue, and that relates to issues of value-based communication. You cannot communicate authentically as an organization unless you have members of the communication and members of the community represented within the team that you're seeking to engage with. And diversity inclusion, again, for this reason, is becoming a business critical issue. So business critical issue from the aspect of responding to a crisis, but also from a values perspective. Mental health and the resilience of practitioners is one of the big lessons from COVID. And there's actually quite a lot of emerging work being done around this area. So this talks to the fact that it's not just those involved within a crisis response effort operationally, but also the communicators that are going to be impacted from a mental health perspective. There's two aspects to this. There's operating in a high pressure environment, and then there's the actuality of a crisis. Once you've seen something, you cannot be unseen, right? And there's some great work being done by people like Amanda Coleman in this area, recognizing that the mental health and well-being of practitioners is a critical part of any response effort. And as part of the planning activity, we need to figure out how to look after employees and point them to resources, give them breaks and so forth, handle post-trauma and post-crisis stress within teams. And this is, it's not something that just happens during a crisis. It's something that happens around milestones and anniversaries where wraparound care and extra support services are required. So that's the second issue. And then the third issue is media and technology. So we've talked about artificial intelligence already. Social media forcing a new form of transparency within an organization. I wrote a book called Brand Anarchy 10 years ago that described this issue. And the media and, the public sees beyond messaging communicated through social forms of media and responds vociferously in the modern day context with first-hand accounts and experiences. The first thing that's going to happen if you have a crisis situation that happens in a modern context is that people will report on that crisis from a first-hand perspective via TikTok and via video, via their own social networks. There's also an emergent impact where people will claim to be at the site of a crisis and not actually be, which is an extremely odd human behavior, but this form of mimicry is an emergent threat. So, absolute transparency is a must. There's a brilliant woman, Lucy Eathop, professor in risk and crisis response at Durham. She's author of a brilliant book called When the Dust Settles, talking about not only the life cycle of crisis, but the aftermath of crisis. And she has this fantastic language. She says, you should not communicate anything during a crisis that you will be prepared to see posted in a family incident room. And that means external and internal communication. Leaks are part of an inevitable part of any modern crisis. Speaker notes are captured on camera. Inappropriate comments are posted on social media. And inevitably under pressure, people speak out inappropriately. and this is part of the high pressure modern environment that we're operating in. Slack and WhatsApp and are great tools to allow for quick communication, but they're also records that will stay with us forever, that are likely to be published as part of any form of evaluation. And actually, there's a point there about public disclosure. It's something we pick out in particular. We've seen a reputational impact by the failure of politicians to disclose WhatsApp messages during the COVID inquiry that's eroded public trust. That should be remembered. These are all part of the management information system that will be part of public record for the future. We talk now briefly about the changing nature of response to crisis in terms of tools that are available. Media monitoring and social listening tools allow us more than ever to understand public sphere and the social sphere and identify those behaviours that I've spoken around a crisis event. It's as likely now that an organisation will be alerted to a crisis through its operational responses as it will through social media monitoring. And social tools can help both understand that context, but separate human response, human messages posted by people, really human beings, and trolls and people with nefarious intent. AI is an issue we explored about. AI is being applied, machine learning, natural language processing is being used within tools as part of a data set response to emergency response. Larger language models are not in the main yet being used. Things like Anthropic, Gemini or ChatGPT, because of the nervousness around security and data security. There's a piece of research published by a risk management specialist, Philip Bowman's at the end of last year, that said, this is an emergent area that practitioners are just starting to explore. Finally, I'm grateful to the CIPR Crisis Communication Network. It published a skills guide at the end of last year called Drafting a Communication Plan. Drafting a crisis communication plan that outlines the best practice processes of responding to a crisis. We've contextualized that and built on that in this paper that's going to be published next week. I want to leave with this final point that no organization really wants to go through a crisis, but we've learned through COVID, through extreme weather events, they are a natural fact of life. I think the context within management and within corporate communications and public relations has changed post-COVID, where they're seen as events that an organization will face, but they are an opportunity to learn, to adapt and grow. They expose weak points in an organization and vulnerabilities. They push it to its limits, but something stronger almost certainly emerges. And that's a really important fact. Feature that I think within management we're shifting from, and I really wanted to leave you with. Before we go to Q&A, there's 3 really good documents that I've referenced through this on this white paper that respond to the emerging area of contemporary crisis management, crisis communication. There's the CIPR Crisis Communication Network document put together by a multidisciplinary team of practitioners all operating in risk. Really good document. There's the document published by the National Protective Security Authority that characterizes the nature of insider risk, a particular classification of risk that organizations should be aware of. As I said, we're beholden. We look often at external factors and don't consider the internal. The internal is equally, if not more important. And the third one is the where we started this conversation around the Global Risk Report by the World Economic Forum. An excellent piece of work that's published each year that characterizes both short-term 2-year outlook and long-term risks that should be part of any risk planning activity. And with that, PJ, I'm going to close this down, and hopefully we've got some questions. We can carry on the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that, Stephen. I'll dive right into the questions. So how does one begin to tackle fake news in the age of AI and its potential impact on corporate communications?
That's a really great question. So I spoke to, there's two issues right at the forefront at the moment of corporate communications. Concern within corporate communications, there's the issue of polarization and how an organization responds to an issue that is going to potentially upset a significant cohort of its stakeholders. Number one. Second one is this one. There's a brilliant piece of work actually last week, about a month ago, published in Public Relations Review that spoke to 20 specialists operating in crisis communication teams, and it characterized how they responded to issues exactly like this. And it, in fact, let's put this in the blog post that we follow up, but it set out a methodology for how you'd deal with a fake news attack on an organization, and it called it watchful waiting, this process. And there's 4 or 5 steps to this. The critical step is understanding how stakeholders within your communities are responding to a fake news attack. So if people see it as clearly as fake news, you don't respond. If they're ignoring it, you don't respond. But if it develops traction within your communities, it's being reshared, people are commenting on it, and it starts to escalate as a piece of content and is passed from stakeholder to stakeholder, network to network, then clearly it's escalating. That is the time when you step in and you respond. They set out also how the nature of response, and that comes down to organizational leadership first and foremost, but then also the media channels and the communities that you've built as an organization over time. So that's your websites, your apps, and it's your social media channels, and that's where you debunk or refute these issues. But really, really great question. Something that's absolutely top of mind, and actually is an issue that, as I say, Public Relations Review published a really great study on, and we'll include that in the follow-up blog for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And how should an organization respond to one of their major social media pages being taken down through a cyber attack?
The nature of cyber attacks, as I suggested, is increasing. Typically, these are nefarious attacks, ransomware and attacks and so forth, and they, in this case, very usually get escalated to insurers, and the insurers have a process for determining how to respond from a risk perspective. So often it's taken completely out of the hands of the corporate communications teams. And responses can include taking legal action, coming to some sort of compromise, although no one would ever admit doing that, or some other course of mediation to address the issue. If that's not the case, if it's not an attack from an external attack on the organization, and it's an insider attack or some other form of attack, then Twitter aside, X aside, all the social media platforms have a robust trust and confidence means of engagement and recovering a social media account. We were involved in a case literally last week where we recovered an Instagram account, and there's a very robust set out process for that. The one counterpoint to that is X. X is a complete mess. Corporate communications at the moment functions are in the undecided about how to to deal and manage with X. And if you try and engage with X around any issue like this, you won't get a response.
Yeah. And how would you tackle the issue of a senior team not seeing the importance of crisis comms?
It's very common. Download this document and put it in front of them. I would start when it's launched on Tuesday next week. I would start from a risk perspective. The areas that we've talked about, particularly that were highlighted in the World Economic Forum report, touch every organization in some form. So through a horizon scanning exercise, look at those as a start point and look at the aspects of insider risk, as Rob Cartwright cites, and look at how those might be impacting your organization. And the big one at the moment is artificial intelligence. Every organization is going to have its moment with artificial intelligence, either through the use of by employees or because it's applied for good or bad within some form of the internal systems within an organization. Start with those points, put that risk exercise under the nose of directors, your direct line reports, elevate it, and they will pay attention.
Okay, cool. And do you think the issues discussed in this presentation also apply to the public sector?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, public sector, honestly, any colleague working in council communications at the moment in a public authority, I really appreciate the work you're doing. And I've totally realized just through the conversations, I have day in, day out, the pressures that you are under. Many organizations in the public sector are operating in a cost of living crisis. Their funding is being cut. And, this story hasn't broken through, apart from, the city of Birmingham. This story hasn't broken through yet into mainstream public consciousness of exactly how challenging an environment corporate communications are working in. Yet, those same corporate communicators have to maintain public trust and confidence in public services. It's a massive challenge, and I completely appreciate the services that people the work that's been doing in that area. They really are at the sharp end.
And how can one manage internal communications during a crisis, especially concerning employee engagement, who are usually the brand advocates?
This is one of the areas where we got really fit during COVID in terms of the internal systems and processes for employee engagement were really well developed. If they didn't exist before, they do now. So the very fact that we're all organizations are operating, certainly for knowledge workers operating in a virtual environment. So it's easier than ever to assemble people on if a Slack channel doesn't already exist, or some sort of digital channel like a Slack channel doesn't exist, you can get people together very quickly. You can get multidisciplinary cross-functional teams together very quickly on mediums such as Zoom. And that is one of the positive outcomes of COVID, that we're able to operate in this way now, and it's completely natural. And these channels are used in these sorts of ways to, not only bring employees together, but to bring, individuals together, teams together within an organization to respond to risk. So the influencer example is an absolute classic case in point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so this question, the value-based comms crisis element is really interesting. Do some organizations miscalculate value-based campaigns and it backfires? Can it ever work out in favor of the organization if their values align with their target audience or market?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of examples, aren't there, of organizations that have completely misjudged this and have upset, the trans community or the LGBTQ community by just completely getting it wrong and being performative. If you're doing it performative, don't do it. Seemingly, meanwhile, there's also examples of organizations that do it exceptionally well. You know, and everyone talks about the poster child of Patagonia. That does it really, really well. And you know, there's everything in between. You know, classic, the case in point I give is my water company. Live up in the north of England. Northumbria Water is my water company. They've got a glossy ESG report. Yeah, you know, there's also sewage being pumped out onto our local beaches. You know, and that gap between, you know, what an organisation says and what it actually does is you know, the dissonance here that leads to these value-based issues. So, you know, if you're as an organisation going to lean into a values-based, purpose-led approach to your communication, it has to come from the leadership. It has to be authentic. And you know, it has to be meaningful both to the communities within your organisation and the communities that you serve as an organisation.
Okay, and what is the best way to apply a crisis management simulation to prepare one of your spokespeople?
So there's some brilliant technologies been developed in this. We work with Kate Hartley and her team at Popeo, who have developed this virtual environment for crisis simulation. You know, a shout out because to Kate, because you know, she also helped contribute to this paper. But you know, that's a really good virtual system. Also, you know, there's a question about the public sector and you know, the application of these sorts of techniques within public sector. Well, you know, some of the best crisis response and simulations are done in the public sector. You know, in terms of creating a simulation exercise. You know, colleagues ahead of COVID often, you know, have been through, perhaps not the extreme example of COVID, but I've been through exercises that, you know, prepared for a pandemic and so forth. So there's those two approaches. There's the management tool, there's management tools that exist, but virtual environments and tools that exist, but you know, also you know, crisis preparedness and testing is you know, a management function.
Okay, and so this person is asking, as the sole person who deals with crisis comms in their organisation, huge responsibility, to what extent is it useful to anticipate specific potential crises and come up with plans to respond?
Well, so you'll be here all day if you spend you know, if you try and think about every eventuality, and you just can't, but you can talk to the generic, where you look at areas of operational risk within an organization, areas of stakeholder risk within an organization, and then the externalities, as the World Economic Forum described, and you know, look at the implications of each of those. Actually, you know, one of the areas where AI is helping us explore these sorts of issues and break out beyond our biases is in, you know, in considering aspects of risk that you wouldn't necessarily be front of mind. Part of the problem is within an organization is you get this inherent bias associated with the culture, where you know, it's just it probably isn't appropriate to cite as a risk, you know, the CEO having being badly behaved or inappropriate, you know, and it needs possibly needs an external perspective often to call that out. So you know, so yes, there's processes you can follow from a horizon scanning perspective, but also, you know, bringing in that external perspective and expertise is probably going to be important and powerful.
Okay, and this one, I guess, kind of relates to the idea of someone high up in a company internally doing something bad. So when fake news or false accusations apply to an individual rather than the business as a whole, should the business still respond?
Difficult to say without knowing the exact context. If it is, if it is the CEO or someone high up and important and influential within the organisation, almost certainly, there'll be limited separation between the organisation and that individual and their leadership. So yes. In other instances, it's hard. It's impossible to understand without knowing the exact context. As I say, that University of Kent studies really brilliant piece of work. As much because it's practical and it spoke to 20 crisis communicators about who had actually dealt with fake news attacks, rather than being conceptual and theoretical. And it synthesizes process. That I'd encourage you we'll put in this follow-up blog post. It's just impossible to respond to that without knowing a particular situation.
Okay, and building on the question about senior teams, how can people encourage leaders about the importance of fronting a crisis response? So understandably, there's a lot of reluctance to put people forward, for people to come forward to do that.
Yeah, it's something people need preparation in and training in, because equally done badly, it can exacerbate and amplify, make a bad situation worse. But typically within any crisis communication response, it's the most senior person within the organization that is expected and will most quickly build trust with publics as part of a response team. If there's a political component to it, if there's a public sector component to it, then almost certainly the same applies, that it's the most senior person responsible who's expected to stand up and respond. So there's lots of evidence to support that fact.
Okay, so we're nearing the end of our time together. We've had lots of questions, so we will, as I've mentioned before, we'll do a follow-up blog post and submit them to you, Stephen, and get your answers on those. So yeah, we'll finish up here. So thank you, Stephen, for all of the insight, and hopefully we'll all be prepared now for anything that 2024 happens to throw our way going forward. We'll see. And thank you to everybody who joined our session this morning. We've had loads of questions, as I say, but if you have any extra ones for Stephen or for us, you can get in touch via our email at info@vulio.com. So yes, so it's goodbye from me, and yeah, goodbye from Stephen.
Thanks very much. And again, watch out for this report. It's out Tuesday. And as I say, there's some really great questions that have come up there, and we'll try and respond to as many of those as possible in the follow-up.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you, everybody, and have a good day.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.